It's been fun going through the Gospel of John like we have. I've actually been seeing it in different lights myself. And so that's always fun to kind of bring it up. I was just going to kind of review a little bit of where we went through last week. We were talking about how Yeshua was and is not what the world is looking for. We all have those expectations of things, and they did in their day about what Messiah was going to do, who he was going to be, and of course, his ways are not our ways, his thoughts are not our thoughts. And so when he did show up, in spite of all the different prophecies, in spite of all the different things that they could have recognized him by, so many of them missed him. And of course, we're no different now, are we? As far as Yeshua is not what the world is looking for. That we even have a picture in most of our churches and most of our fellowships of who Jesus is and what Jesus has done and Yeshua and all those other kind of things. And he's not, when he shows up, he's not going to look and fit the way people most expect. So that is still an ongoing thing. We talked about that Yeshua is set apart from others who have claimed to be the Messiah. And we spent a lot of time talking about John the Baptist last week. And I hope that was insightful. I enjoyed that. That was fun going through that. But John the Baptist was one whose message had been spread around the Mediterranean a good bit. Shows up in the book of Acts a lot. But he was pointing to the one that was coming after him. We talked about that you can find the Messiah in the Torah and the prophets. Remember, they didn't have the Gospels, they didn't have the New Testament to lead people to Christ. They only had the Torah. They only had the Tanakh and the prophets and all those things. And yet, people could still lead them to Messiah without the New Testament at all. How many of us could do that today? How many of our churches could do that, could lead people to Messiah without the New Testament? It's a lot harder. We don't really know how to do it. And we're not very effective at it in that regard. We looked at some of these passages in John chapter 1 where the Gospel, John, he's trying to establish this idea that Messiah can be found in the Torah. As Philip finds Nathanael and tells him, we found the one that Moses in the Torah and also the prophets wrote about, Yeshua of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. That's in John 1:45. So he's trying to set up that we found him. We recognize him. All the things that Moses and the prophets wrote about, we're seeing in this Yeshua from Nazareth. And of course, the response was, how could anything good come out of Nazareth? So that was not expected. And yet, there it is. We talked about some characteristics of the Messiah, that he was going to be of David's line, he's going to be born of Bethlehem. They knew that. When the Magi showed up, they were able to quote the prophecy from Micah. So they had some things that they were looking for. They had the great debates in their day and ours about whether it was Messiah ben Yosef, the suffering servant, or Messiah ben David, the conquering king and hero. They debated whether it was one Messiah who would come twice or two Messiahs coming once. And you can see that in the rabbinic literature. You can see that in a lot of their discussions of things. But again, I think if I remember correctly, the two Messiahs idea was becoming more of the common one. So they were rejecting this one Messiah coming twice, and yet that's what he came to do. We know that we saw how Philip knows how Yeshua fits the profile of the Messiah, and he assumes that Nathanael knows enough or has been taught what the Torah and prophets say about the Messiah so they can recognize him. And then Micah 4:1-6 is that passage where Yeshua goes to him and tells him, I saw you under the fig tree, and he jumps on that. Keith, you liked that a lot last week. That he jumps on it, and all of a sudden, man, that just turns the whole conversation for him. Because Yeshua is able to basically call him and talk to him in terms of the kingdom and seeing him in those in those ways. So at this point, this is where I didn't get to last week, in the sense of that the Messiah will perform certain signs. The Messiah will show certain evidences for who He is and demonstrate certain things. And that shows up in John. He says several times to call upon the people to believe the signs and the works that they see Him doing. This is John chapter 10, verse 37. If I don't do the works of my Father, don't believe me. But if I do, even if you don't trust me, trust the deeds, trust the works, trust the signs that you see me doing, that you may come to know and continue to understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. So look, what he's claiming with this passage, that he is doing the same kind of works that his Father is doing, that his Father has done. Okay? And if you don't believe me, even if you don't trust what I'm saying, then trust what I'm doing. Now, what's the danger with that, or what's the flip side from that, about the nature of even false prophets, or the nature of the Antichrist of the end times? Are they going to be able to do things and perform miracles and show signs and things like that? Yes. Yes, they are. And what's the Deuteronomy 13? How does that passage tie into this? Y'all remember that? I don't have it up here, so flip back over to Deuteronomy chapter 13. This is a sidetrack. I didn't even... Well, he says some things about a prophet who comes and even does certain things.
Oh, yeah. If he doesn't attest to the Torah.
Right. He says, whatever I command you, take care and do it. You are not to add to it or take away from it. That's an important thing. But Deuteronomy 13:2 says, suppose a prophet or a dreamer of dreams rises up among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or wonder he spoke to you comes true. So, some people, a false prophet and such, can show up and do something, a powerful work, a powerful miracle, and even if it comes true, and then he goes on and says, but let's follow after other gods that you have not known, and let us serve them. Then you must not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for Adonai your God is testing you to find out whether you love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul. Adonai your God you will follow, and Him you will fear. His commandments, His mitzvot you will keep. To His voice you will listen. Him you will serve, and to Him you will cling. That prophet or dreamer of dreams must be put to death, for he has spoken falsehood against Adonai your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery, to entice you from the way of Adonai your God, commanded you to walk, so you will purge the evil from your midst. So how do we know the way that Adonai our God has commanded us to walk? Through His Word, through His Torah, right? That's Him demonstrating this. If you're going to be my people, this is how you are going to walk. And so even if somebody comes along and says and shows these great signs, but they're telling you to walk and live in a different manner, then that person is clearly a false prophet. And that was an article that I shared last week or so, that this is one of our biggest stumbling blocks in reaching and connecting with the Jewish people about Messiah. Because we, in our traditional theology, say that Jesus came along and fulfilled the Torah, fulfilled the law, so you don't have to worry about living that way anymore. And so a Jewish person comes along and hears that and says, well, I don't care what miracles He did. If He really taught that, then He cannot be the Messiah because He's violating Deuteronomy 13. And so that is one of our biggest stumbling blocks to reaching the Jewish people with faith in Christ. Because we're telling them, you can believe in Jesus and now you can go eat your ham sandwich and go live however you want and throw out all the other stuff that God told you how to live. Whereas the Scripture specifically says, even if somebody shows up and does great things, but they tell you to live a different way, then he is clearly not from me. So our own theology has put one of our biggest stumbling blocks in the way of Jewish people coming to faith in Christ. Does that make sense? So John is pointing them to say, believe the signs. If you don't trust me yet, believe the works. Then you may come. So the understanding that he is from the Father, that he is in the Father, will come once they start paying more attention to what he's doing. Okay? He goes on in another passage in John chapter 14. That Yeshua said to him, have I been with you for so long a time and you haven't come to know me, Philip? So he's even talking to his disciples. He says, he who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Okay, I'm showing you. I've been showing you. I've been doing everything that he's telling me to do. I've been living the way he's told us all to live in a perfect and complete manner. He says, don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own, but the Father dwelling in me does his works. Okay? So, whose words is he really speaking? He's speaking the Father's words. So is anything that Jesus says ever going to contradict what the Father has already spoken? No. And yet so much of our traditional theology does that as if Jesus and the Father, their teachings are in contradiction or in conflict, and they're not. That Jesus somehow negates what has come before, and the Messiah would not do that. Okay? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own, but the Father dwelling in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, or at least believe because of the works themselves. You may not believe what I say just yet, but you see what I'm doing. I'm doing things that only the Messiah can do. I'm doing things as one who is coming in the authority of the Father, and only that one can do. And of course, when the Pharisees and the others come and accuse him, they say, well, what does he say? Well, you're driving out demons by whose power and whose authority? You're not doing it with the Father's authority. They accuse him of doing it with the authority of Beelzebub or some of the prince of demons or something else like that. They accuse him of living under somebody else's authority. And Yeshua is always trying to establish the fact that, no, I am working and I am speaking and I am living in the Father's authority. And so John is trying to get that issue settled. The Gospel of John is commonly organized around the 7 signs or miracles designated that he specifically points out. We showed this one a couple of weeks ago. There's the changing of the water into wine. And I've been trying to figure out, this is something I've been trying to find parallels in the life of Moses and such, since he is a prophet like unto Moses. Changing water into wine. I was trying to find a parallel for that in the life of Moses.
Water into blood.
Water into blood, yes, that's one. The other one I was thinking of is the bitter water being made sweet. But yes, the Nile and the water turning into the blood, which is a symbol of the wine, or the wine is a symbol of blood. There's the choo-choo again. The second one is the healing of the royal official's son. Now, what kind of parallel might you find in that?
Killing the Pharaoh.
This is kind of an opposite. Whereas Moses, the Pharaoh's official and the official's son died, he's bringing the leader's son back to life. The firstborn dies in Moses' life. But here, the official son is brought to life. The healing of the paralytic at Bethsaida, that one I'm still working on. I haven't found a good parallel for that. Miriam, well, possibly. But that one comes up, that one would be an Israelite who has of leprosy. Yeah. What's that?
Lashon Hara, which is Hebrew.
Okay.
It has to do with
The spoken, the mouth. Yes. Yes. Then there's the feeding of the 5,000. But how does he do that? I mean, he feeds the 5,000 and such, but there's all that manna that's in the wilderness, the manna and the quail and all that abundance that comes. So, I mean, there are some parallels. That didn't show up. The walking on water is in chapter 6. And there's the parting of the waters. And, you think about it in that sense, Moses, the waters had to part for Moses to walk through on dry ground. Yeshua comes along and goes, I don't even need to do that. And can Yeshua even have others? Moses led people through on dry ground on the waters, but could Yeshua even bring somebody out on top of the water? Yes, he did, briefly. So could he lead us across the water? Yes. We have to keep our eyes fixed on him and not on the storm and the waves, because as soon as Peter took his eyes off, started noticing everything else, then he started to sink. But those kind of limitations, Moses, they had the two partings of the water at the Red Sea and at the Jordan River with Joshua and such. But, those, Yeshua can go even beyond that. We don't have to worry about parting the water at all. And then there is the healing of the man born blind in chapter 9. I haven't necessarily found a parallel for that one yet, unless there is the plague of darkness. He's bringing a whole people. He's bringing a whole people out of darkness and into light. He's helping them, those who are not seeing the Lord's salvation, to seeing it. That one's a little harder to make. And then there's the raising of Lazarus there at the end. Those are the 7 signs that John is typically organized around. When you see commentaries, when you see a sermon series and stuff like that, they'll oftentimes base them off of these 7 signs. And he does that on purpose. John is doing that on purpose. And when Yeshua comes and says, believe the signs and the works that you are talking about, John has organized it around these 7. And now, are these the only miracles that he did? Clearly not. Okay, because John even himself later on says that, look, even if there are so many things that Yeshua did that there's not enough books to contain what he did. Gabriel, you want to make a point?
Gary, I want you to back me up on this. Correct me if I'm wrong. You leaving it all on me? Okay. The 3 signs, rabbinically, as I recall, that directly correlate to the Messiah are the healing of the man born blind. He's one of the 3.
Mm-hmm.
Second is healing an Israelite with leprosy. And then the third is casting out a demon from someone that is mute.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the 3 signs that are rabbinically correlated to the...
And the other Gospels take care of a lot of those.
Yeah.
The people with leprosy in Matthew and such, he specifically says, now go and show yourselves to the priest as a testimony to them. And of course they don't necessarily go and do it. And then the mute, the demon, I don't think the mute spirit is in John. I forgot to look that up.
I did, but it's not.
But so those are some of the other Gospels seem to be taking care of those kind of signs. Of course,
I'm pretty sure they're all in Matthew, which is directed more
towards the Jewish people.
Yeah.
Now, of course, what's the significance of organizing it around 7? 7 signs. It's a number of completeness, of maturity, of fullness. So he is trying to make a full and complete picture of the signs that demonstrate that Yeshua is the Messiah. Believe the works, believe the signs that he has done. And of course, some will add and consider the resurrection an 8th sign after the week, of creation, with the new creation dawning of the new covenant. So the 8th sign is the inauguration of the new era, kind of a thing of how that's understood, or a new life. So some people will look at it like that. But what's interesting is when you're looking at it, some of the things that Messiah will do, we also understand that Messiah is going to fulfill the feast that we just read about in the Leviticus passages. He will fulfill the feast. So one of the things that separates John from the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, those are talked about in terms of being his ministry in the Galilee area, whereas John highlights his Judean ministry. Okay? But why is Yeshua in Judah? Why is he in and around Jerusalem?
Where you had to go to keep the feast.
Because the feasts, certain feasts require you to be in Jerusalem at certain times. And so John is building the gospel also in terms of when Yeshua goes to Jerusalem for the feast, for the different feasts. So he points it as a fulfillment of the spring feasts. In John chapter 2, if y'all want to follow along here, John chapter 2, verse 12, he points out, it says, after this, Yeshua went down to Capernaum with his mother, brothers, and disciples, and they stayed there a few days. The Jewish feast of Passover was near, so Yeshua went up to Jerusalem. And in the temple, he found the merchants selling oxen, sheep, and doves, and also the money changers sitting there. Of course, what does he do? He throws them out. Watch out, watch out. Light back there got moved. Okay, you're on it. And of course, how does cleansing the temple, how does cleansing the Father's house even parallel with what happens in the feast? Getting the leaven out of the Father's house. That's the responsibility of the firstborn son, is to help the Father get the leaven out of the house. And so right off the bat, in one of his first times being demonstrated going to Jerusalem, he is going and he's cleansing the temple of the leaven that is in there. And of course the buying of selling and all these things. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace. And of course they come back and they say, well, what sign do you show us, basically, that you claim to have authority to do all of this? And that's when he gives them the sign of his death and resurrection. Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days. Okay? Let's see. So after he was raised from the dead, this is chapter 2, verse 22. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he was talking about this. Then they believed the scripture and the word that Yeshua had spoken. Okay? So they didn't even fully understand or even fully believe everything until after the resurrection. It says, now when he was in Jerusalem for the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name, seeing the signs that he was doing. Okay, so that's an important thing. He was in Jerusalem for the Passover. Then the next one you see is in John chapter 5, verse 1. And he says, after this, there was a Jewish feast, and Yeshua went up to Jerusalem. Now, you don't have to go up to Jerusalem for all the feasts. But what's the next one on the calendar that requires you to go up to Jerusalem? Most likely, this was Shavuot. Yes?
Is the reason the details left out is because it was just assumed or understood at that time where we've lost that understanding over time?
More than likely, yes, that's the case. And he's kind of expecting people to know this is what comes next on the calendar. But because that's the one that would be next. That's the only one that comes next that would require him to go to Jerusalem. So, of course, what's the third one that requires him to go to Jerusalem? Tabernacles. And that's later, yes.
For Shavuot, the discussion he has is when he teaches.
Yes. Yeah, when you read in chapter 5 and chapter 6 and such like that, or leading up to that, the discussion that takes place in chapter 5 parallels a lot of what you talk about at Shavuot. So that's why I'm kind of suggesting that it's probably that one. It's the Feast of Weeks or the Feast of Pentecost, which is what's coming for us. Then the next one is John chapter 6, verse 4. And this one's the challenging one. It says, chapter 6, verse 1 says, "Afterwards Yeshua went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they were watching the signs he was performing on the sick. Then Yeshua went up to the mountainside and sat down there with his disciples. Passover, the Jewish feast, was near. Then lifting up his eyes and seeing a large crowd coming to him, Yeshua said to Philip," okay? So there are some out there that teach that this was an insertion, that Yeshua's ministry was really just 1 year, and that this was not necessarily an authentic thing. But what's the unusual thing about this whole section? One of the things that gives it a little credibility in my eyes anyway, is that it's Passover, but in this whole section there is no discussion of him going to Judea. There's no discussion of him going to Jerusalem for Passover. What's that? He ends up going in the opposite direction. So he goes further away from Jerusalem in the narrative, and he never goes towards Jerusalem. And so that makes me think, or at least it lends some credibility to the idea that that statement, Passover in verse 4, may not be accurate. Yes, Gabriel?
And the whole, he would have to be in Jerusalem for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or he would be breaking the law and therefore not be.
Right. If Yeshua doesn't go to Jerusalem for Passover, he becomes a lawbreaker, doesn't he?
Yeah. For Feast of Unleavened Bread, not Passover.
Well, you're right, not for Passover, but he has to be there for unleavened bread and such. But so, for Yeshua, for them to mention Passover, but have no indication of him going to Jerusalem, is a problem. Because the Messiah would not miss that in Jerusalem.
So
But
you're saying that all the cities had to come to Jerusalem?
not all of them.
Only
unleavened bread.
Shavuot, and Sukkot.
Yeah. Only those three require Jewish men to be in Jerusalem.
Say that again.
Only the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Shavuot or Pentecost, and then the Feast of Sukkot or Tabernacles. Those are the only three that are required that Jewish men would be there in Jerusalem at
And
temple.
in the first century, the term unleavened bread and Passover
Were
were
interchangeable.
Interchangeable. Yeah. So those three were the only ones.
Did they have to come for Passover?
Well, unleavened bread and Passover were kind of
Virtually
synonymous
the same
because they're back to back.
Passover is the day before unleavened bread.
Yeah. So if they're in Jerusalem, they're coming for unleavened bread. They will be in Jerusalem for Passover. And of course, that's why the crowd in Acts chapter 2, they're there at Pentecost or Shavuot, and that's why there's a large crowd of Jewish men from all over the world that have come there for that day, because that's a requirement. That's why Paul keeps wanting to go back. He missed Passover, he missed unleavened bread, but he's trying to get back to Jerusalem in time for Shavuot. So you see that play out in the book of Acts. Yes.
I want to point out that there are some church fathers who, early church fathers, even before
Polycarp, I think.
Isaiah, that talked about Jesus' ministry only being 1 year.
Yes.
Especially out of the Synoptic Gospels.
Yes.
They see that. But
So this is the.
we get the 3 or 3.5 years from John.
Yes.
It's by making the unnamed one in chapter 5 a Passover, and we have this Passover here. But even if the unnamed one is not a Passover, you still only have just 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Because it could be around Passover, and maybe it's just right after, or during kind of Walmart. We're not trying to say that it's not, but there are some questions.
But yeah, some of the early church fathers do suggest that Yeshua's ministry was only 1 year. This is the place where that comes from, where it's built. And some have argued at least that there are some Catholic or theological reasons why they wanted to make it 3 years thing. I'm not necessarily going to go into all that or argue about that. But what I will say is that if this is a genuine passage and this is Passover, then he should be going to Jerusalem. And it's not that's not in the story.
Well, what about the Day of Atonement? Did they not have to?
They didn't have to be there for that. That could be anywhere. Because that only had to happen in Jerusalem, and then it's announced to everywhere else.
Yeah. So the forerunner of salvation is proclaimed.
Yeah. So, the next one is in John chapter 7. And it says, after these events, this is chapter 7, verse 1, Yeshua was walking about in the Galilee. He did not want to walk in Judea because the Judean leaders wanted to kill him. Now the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles was near. Therefore his brothers said to him, leave here and go to Judea. Okay, so the feast is here, and the first thing that gets mentioned about is like, dude, you got to be going to Jerusalem. And so leave here and go to Judea so your disciples also may see the works you are doing. No one who wants to be well known does everything in secret. If you are doing these things, show yourself to the world, for not even his brothers were trusting in him. Therefore Yeshua said to them, my time has not yet come, but your time is always at hand. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify that its works are evil. You go on up to the feast. I'm not going to this feast, because my time has yet fully come. After saying these things, he stayed in the Galilee. But after his brothers went to the feast, he also went, not openly, but secretly. So he didn't go with a lot of pomp and circumstance and a lot of flash, trying to draw a lot of attention. He wasn't going to go because this was not the right time, because certain things happen, or the Feast of Tabernacles means certain things. And this was not the time for him to fulfill the Feast of Tabernacles.
Well, why did he tell him he wasn't going?
Well, he told them he wasn't going. I'm not going to this feast because my time hasn't yet fully come. He is not going to come in fulfillment of the Feast of Tabernacles at this time like they want him to. Because the Feast of Tabernacles is an event of the second coming. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Does that make sense? So this is not the time for him to go in his fullness for the Feast of Tabernacles. So he does so, he still goes, but he does not openly, but secretly. Okay? Yes.
They were asking him, okay, you're Messiah, so be Messiah of David.
Yeah.
Right. They're basically calling upon him to be the one who is the Messiah ben David, the one who is the conquering king and hero. They want to skip all of the suffering servant stuff and get straight to the kick out Rome and conquer the Roman stuff. You know, it's kind of we want to skip the hard stuff and go straight to the victory stuff.
So this was the servant, the servant not now.
Yeah, his first coming is the suffering servant. But they want to skip all that stuff and go straight to the victory. And he says, guys, if you want to have the victory, we got to go through this first. This is what has to happen first. So then look at verse 14. It says, about halfway through the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Sukkot, Yeshua went up to the temple and began teaching. Okay? So he's there.
He was there the whole time.
And he was there the whole time, but I mean, he's emphasizing about halfway through the feast. And so now he's starting to teach more and more of these things and all of their expectations of that. And we're going to go into those more later. And then verse 37 says, on the last and the greatest day of the feast, Yeshua stands up and cried out loudly, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Everything that he says in that conversation is paralleling things that were happening in the temple. A ceremony of the water and such as that. So what he's talking about is he's able to look at all that they're doing, and he says, guys, this is still talking about me. Okay? But he's making the point of saying, this is the Feast of Tabernacles. He is there. Halfway through the feast, he starts making a public announcement, appearances. On the last and the greatest day of the feast, he's drawing attention to himself, and the Pharisees and things don't like it. Okay? But again, John is organizing things not only around the 7 signs, he's also organizing things around the feasts. And that's something that traditional theology typically doesn't look at.
And that ceremony comes from one of the Psalms of Ascent, doesn't it?
Yes. I'm not going to get into that right now. But you can remind me of that later, okay? Psalms of Ascent, which is
where the
Psalm 20.
Yeah, Psalm
120.
And goes on a bit, but when they're songs that they're supposed to sing when they're going up to the capital.
So then the next feast, that's not one of the official Moedim and such, but it's in chapter 10, verse 22. Then came the festival of dedication, or Hanukkah, and it was winter in Jerusalem. And Yeshua was walking in the temple around Solomon's colonnade. So, this one's one that came up in the time between the Testaments. After the Greeks had invaded, they had desecrated the temple. This is the rededication of the temple. And Yeshua wasn't required to be in Jerusalem, but he was still there for whatever reason. And they were celebrating this moment of this rededication of the temple. But so it's fun to point out to many church people and Christians and things that, oh, by the way, Hanukkah is in the New Testament. So, yes.
Okay. Hanukkah was between the Testament and it was when the Maccabees.
Yes, the Maccabean revolt in the time between the Testaments. Antiochus Epiphanes. Yes.
So, does that have anything to do with the Antichrist that came?
Yes. Because remember, when in Matthew 24, when Yeshua is talking about the end times kind of stuff, and he talks about when you see the abomination of desolation, these things are coming. Well, to all the Jewish people who were there in that time, the abomination of desolation is something that happened 150, 200 years ago. In their mind.
When Antiochus set up the statue
Yeah.
for the temple.
Yeah, Antiochus set up the statue. He desecrated the altar with a pig and all those other types of things. But yet Yeshua is talking about the abomination of desolation as something that's coming in the future. So that picture. So in order to understand some of the things that Yeshua is talking about the end time, we need to take a closer look at some of the things that happened for Hanukkah. So again, they were hearing that and they were thinking about an event that has already happened, and Yeshua is talking about an event in the future. So that's a good question. It does. Even though Hanukkah is not one of the Moedim listed in Leviticus, there's something about this event that still plays into the story. Don't know exactly how that works, but it's still important enough that Yeshua was in Jerusalem at that time.
And it's while he's there at Hanukkah, they ask him, "Are you the Messiah?" And the Maccabees were seen, for a time at least, as the archetypes, if not the Messiah themselves.
Yeah, and this is Yeshua basically says. This is where Yeshua says, "I am the Father. I and the Father are one." And the Judean leaders pick up stones to stone him, because after all, they're trying to dedicate the temple, or they're celebrating a rededication of a temple from blasphemy, and they're accusing him of speaking blasphemy at the dedication ceremony. And he says, "I've shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these are you going to stone me?" And the Judean leaders answered, "We aren't stoning you for a good work, but for blasphemy. Though you are a man, you make yourself God." Which is exactly what Antiochus Epiphanes had done. He declared himself deity. in those moments. So they're seeing what Jesus is talking about, what Yeshua is talking about as, man, we're making the same mistake all over again. Yes, Gabriel.
Well, at Hanukkah, this is a bit of a rabbit, not much. But the Maccabees kind of start a motif that we see throughout history, where God uses someone named the Hammer to defeat the people coming up against God.
Okay.
And we see this throughout history. The Maccabees, the word Maccabees means hammer. The second most prominent thing that we see is when the Muslims were invading France. The man that stopped them was Charles Martel, and Martel means the hammer. John Zabisky III, who defeated the Turks outside the walls of Vienna and saved the Holy Roman Empire from Islam, was nicknamed the Hammer. And there's several other people that have been nicknamed the Hammer over history that have saved Judaism or Christianity in one way or another. It's the leitmotif that we see throughout history.
It's interesting how these parallels keep kind of rolling. So Hanukkah, I'm going to get back onto this. No, you're right. That's a very good, interesting thing. Then you get into John chapter 11, and chapter 11, chapter 12, and chapter 13 are all focusing on this one Passover event. Chapter 11, verse 55 says, "Now the Jewish Passover was near, and many people went up out of the regions to Jerusalem before Passover to purify themselves. So they were searching for Yeshua, saying to one another as they stood in the temple, 'What do you think? Won't he come to the feast at all?' Now the ruling Kohanim and Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should report it so they might arrest him." So the leadership are using the fact that, okay, he is a Jewish man, and if he's going to be a faithful Jewish man, then he will be in Jerusalem for the Passover. So he's going to show up. We just got to keep our eyes open for him.
Counting on the fact that he's going to be a good guy.
Yeah. Yeah. They're counting on him following the law. That's kind of interesting. And then they're going to accuse him of breaking it. Then chapter 12, verse 1, 6 days before Passover, Yeshua came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Yeshua had raised from the dead. So that's chapter 12, verse 1. Then chapter 13, verse 1, says, "Now it was just before the feast of Passover, Yeshua knew that his hour had come to depart from this world to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them until the end. While the Seder meal was happening," back up a little bit. Back in chapter 12, verse 20, you have, "Now there were some Greeks among those who were going up to worship at the feast. These came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee. 'Sir,' they said, 'we want to see Yeshua.'" Okay? So you even have some Greek, or at least some Hellenized Jews, at minimum, but the way it reads, some Greeks were going up to the feast. They might have even been non-Jewish people. They're wanting to participate in the Feast of Passover, or in some way.
They never say they're circumcised Greeks or not, which I find.
No, he doesn't. But somehow or another, they're wanting to go and participate in that. And they want to see Yeshua. Now, it's not the time. Yeshua says the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. And that's when you hear the voice from heaven and such as that. "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." Therefore, the crowd that was standing there heard it, was saying that it had thundered. Others were saying an angel had spoken to him. And this, Yeshua responded, "This voice hasn't come for my sake, but for yours." So presumably those Greek guys at least got to hear some of that. That was going on there. Chapter 13, verse 2, you see that there's a Seder meal that's going on. It's a meal of Passover. Again, if you know nothing about the feast, if you know nothing about the customs and such, that might mean not mean much to you. But John is saying it on purpose. He's saying those kind of things on purpose. And I remember that was one of the defining things for us in this walk, was going to a Seder presentation and seeing all of the symbolism of the meal and how it points to Messiah and different things like that. So that, my first thought was, why didn't I hear about this before? This should be basic. This should be the stuff that we teach all the time, and it's not. Then chapter 19, there's a whole lot of things that happen in between, a lot of discussion and dialogue and such. When you get to chapter 19, verse 31, it says, this is after the crucifixion and such. It says, it was the day of preparation, and the next day was a festival Shabbat, so that the body should not remain on the execution stake or the cross during Shabbat. The Judean leaders asked Pilate to have the legs broken and that they have the bodies taken away. Well, if you don't know the feasts, then what is the day of preparation? What does that mean? What is a Shabbat? What is a festival Shabbat in the middle of the Feast of Unleavened Bread? You have no idea what's going on. But John is speaking it as if you pretty much have an idea of what the chronology is. Yes, Gary?
In a lot of translations, I think in ASB, it actually says a high day.
It does. Okay.
But the literal Greek is, it was a great Shabbat.
A great Shabbat.
And there's not a whole lot that is said about that as far as in the literature, whether
Right.
biblical or historical. And yet, my question is could it possibly be referred to the fact that that year first fruits or the county of Omer fell on Saturday?
That's a very possible.
Well, the offering of the first fruits actually occurred on the Shabbat that year.
That's interesting. And I don't know if the feast, the Jubilee year would make any difference on this, because Yeshua in the other Gospels.
Jubilee normally didn't begin till Yom Kippur. It was counted from the time of Yom Kippur.
Right, but the beginning of Yeshua's ministry, he pretty much announced the Jubilee. Remember that? When he was talking through Isaiah? Today these scriptures are fulfilled in your hearing, the freedom from of the captives and the people born from the blind and such. The year of Jubilee. So this all might be happening within an already declared Jubilee year.
Now, every so often, that would be an extra high Sabbath together with the regular Sabbath, right?
Well, I'm not too sure on, so I'm not going to try to speculate on that. But I know that within the unleavened bread, since it doesn't necessarily, it's not going to follow on the same extended period. The Sabbath within unleavened bread might be sometimes on like the first day, it might be on the third day, it might be on the fifth day within that 1 week. The weekly Sabbath. So there's some dynamics to that calendar that we still don't fully process because we don't live by that calendar. And there's debate on that. There's some conflict. But still, somehow or another, John is still drawing attention to the fact that there's a preparation day, and there's the festival Sabbath or the high Sabbath during the festival of unleavened bread. He's making that point, and again, he's structuring the story around these days that are important. Yes, Gabriel.
And just a little bit of a recap. If the line in John chapter 6, going to Passover, is not original,
Mm-hmm.
and if the unnamed feast is a Shavuot, then all of these events are happening within a year, back to back to back.
Yes, because his ministry started at the beginning, at the Passover, at the beginning of the Gospel of John, and is ending at Passover the following year, if that's accurate. So that's where the 1 year ministry takes place. So it's two Passovers, but within the course of a year.
The lamb was always killed on the 14th.
Yes, that's correct.
So no matter what year it was and what day it was on the 14th.
Right, that's correct.
So,
But the Sabbath wasn't necessarily that day because the month was determined by the new moon.
but there was an 8th Sabbath. I read that somewhere.
That's at Shavuot. That's at Sukkot. The 8th day at the end of Sukkot is a special day. Yes.
Well,
Yes.
unleavened bread has
And
there's Passover, there's the first day of unleavened bread, which is the Shabbat. Then there's the Shabbat within the week of unleavened bread, the weekly Shabbat. And then the 7th day of unleavened bread is also Shabbat.
Yeah, you're right.
Plus you have first fruits within there, the day after the weekly Shabbat.
The day after.
We typically count.
Yeah.
Now, so your rabbinical Jews say that the Passover comes, then the Shabbat of the unleavened bread comes, the first day of unleavened bread, and then immediately following that is your first fruits. That's how the rabbis did it. That's how the Pharisees did it, I should say. The Pharisees, even in the first century, did it. And when the temple fell, that's what went out into with the people. At the temple, the Sadducees did it more like we do it.
Yeah.
Would say that the first fruits fell on the day after the weekly Sabbath within the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So even in the first century, there was
debate on how
to do all that.
And so I'm not going to have it all figured out here either. So, just so you know. But what we do know is that in chapter 20, verse 1, early in the morning on the first day of the week, that is, he doesn't name it, but that would be first fruits. That's when the resurrection takes place, is on the Feast of First Fruits, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. He is the first fruits from the resurrection, or of the resurrection. So every time that, or not every time, but Paul significantly makes the point that Yeshua is the resurrection first fruits. So you have all of the feasts, or he's structuring these things around the feast. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, now Paul said that the Jews had the advantage over the Gentiles. Well, that is the advantage that they had because they had all these thousands of years in these things.
They'd been living these things for so long, and it made sense to them. They knew the process. They knew how it worked. They knew what progresses and what they mean, typically, for a Gentile coming in who hasn't grown up with this stuff. Yeah, I'll be the first one to say it can be confusing.
Yeah.
Because I don't know how, I have to rethink my brain and retrain my brain on how to make sense of this system that I didn't grow up with.
And of course, so much of it revolved around the temple too, and so it was the logistics of the temple. Everything was happening, especially those 3 feet, around the temple. And so it was, well, even with the ones you weren't there at, was around the temple. But the idea that we could come in and without having that picture of the temple happening year after year after year, seeing them do it at the temple, and just trying to put it in our head, it makes it a little hard sometimes to kind of, because even in the first century, there was debate on when and how to do things. For example, the Essene group, you had the Pharisees and Sadducees, there was also the Essenes. And many people say John the Baptist was a part of it. Well, the Essenes actually did Passover on the night of their Seder meal on the night of the 13th. And then they had Passover of course, what we see with Yeshua and the disciples, they're actually having this Seder meal more in the time frame of the Essenes in that year he died, because obviously he is the Passover lamb, he's dying on the 14th. So by the time it comes around on the evening of the 14th, he's going to be dead.
Well, no. Technically, if the evening starts on night before.
Right, I understand it. And
So-
that's how the Essenes counted, but I'm just saying.
But it's all, that was still the 14th.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure the Samaritans do it similarly to that.
But we're going long, so let me get some of these things. Spring feast, so their fulfillment is highlighted in the Gospel of John. And then there's followed by a period of waiting and growth, the time between the spring feast and the fall feast. Okay? There's that time between where it's the summer, the things are growing, there's the harvest. And in a lot of ways, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are addressing some of these things that exist between the harvest or in the summer, because it's how do you live as we wait? How do we live in this period of waiting? But then you get to the fall feast. And the fall feast, of course, are the Feast of Trumpets, Yom Teruah, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot. Let me ask you this question. Where does John show their fulfillment? Where does John show the fulfillment of the fall feast?
Revelation.
It's in Revelation. Okay? Just like, there's the Gospel of Luke, and we understand that Acts is the next chapter, so to speak. It's the book 2. Revelation is really the book 2 to the Gospel of John, because the fulfillment of the fall feast is highlighted in the book of Revelation. The Feast of Trumpets, or Yom Teruah, is there a coronation of the king in Revelation? Yes, which is what Yom Teruah is one of the aspects of the Feast of Trumpets, is about the coronation of the king, right? So there is a coronation. He is established on the throne in Revelation. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. What's some of the imagery or some of the understanding that we understand with the fall feast of the Day of Atonement? Separating out of the sheep and the goats, right? Does that happen in the book of Revelation? Yeah. There is a distinction made between those who keep the commandments and hold to the testimony of Yeshua, and those who have the mark and the sign of who live in the other way.
The book of life is closed.
The book of life is closed in the book in all of this. The scroll of Daniel is opened, so to speak. And then Feast of Tabernacles is a picture of what? The millennial kingdom, but also even more specifically than that, isn't it also a picture of the wedding? So is there a wedding feast of the Lamb
Festival of the Lamb
in chapter 19? Okay? So everything that happens in the book of Revelation is highlighting the fulfillment of the fall feast. Yes?
I just had a apostrophe.
I think you mean an epiphany. That's a movie quote, by the way.
But we see Hanukkah. There's the temple. A new temple is going to come down. There's going to be a new dedication of that. A new dedication of the temple. So that's going to be there. But do you remember that video a little while ago that was that was put out by the official and rabbinical stuff in Israel about how Purim may be the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, because Yom Kippur, or Kippur, literally means like Purim.
Okay.
And won't eternity be us celebrating Yeshua saving us for eternity?
Yeah, okay, I remember that video. vaguely.
So, could eternity better be, referenced by Purim? In the sense of that we're eternally celebrating what He has done for us and saved us eternally.
That's interesting.
We can do.
There it is. There it is.
But yeah, I do remember that. That was a video put out from Israel and such. But to me, back on this,
Sorry.
it's you're tangent man.
Sorry.
But again, to me, I had never really thought of Revelation like this. That John highlights the fulfillment of the spring feast, while Revelation highlights the fulfillment of the fall feast. And so, again, it's hard for us to understand the Gospel of John. It's hard to understand Revelation if we don't recognize the feasts, because the feasts are the life cycle of the believer, of the people of God. Because every year you see, the first and the second coming lived out in front of you if you are keeping and living the feast. But if you never hear about the feast, if you don't try to understand what they mean, if you don't try to live the feast, then you're missing this powerful picture of the first and second coming on a yearly basis. On a yearly basis, we are getting that message. And how much of that have we really lost in the centuries of ignoring this stuff, to where we can come up with all kinds of crazy explanations for the end times that's totally divorced from the feast cycle. Does that make sense?